We begin tonight with the first public release of deposition transcripts in the impeachment inquiry. The most important thing in the transcripts of the depositions, most important thing in these depositions in the impeachment inquiry that were released today is that there is no defense of Donald Trump in those transcripts. Not one word of defense. The Republican members of the investigating committees who love to play tough guy in the hallway in front of the microphones were timid little sheep in those depositions. Tough guy Jim Jordan was in the room. Trump worshiper Mark Meadows was in the room, and they couldn't come up with a single word to put in those transcripts released today that was helpful to Donald Trump. Donald Trump might not have brought Mark Meadows to a World Series game and to an ultimate fighting spectacle in Madison Square Garden this weekend if Donald Trump knew that Mark Meadows did and said absolutely nothing for him in those depositions. Nothing. Jim Jordan and Mark Meadows are completely different people with the door closed and no cameras allowed. The real evidence in this case is the same, whether the testimony is public or private. But what we discover in private testimony is that there is absolutely no defense of Donald Trump being offered by Republicans or by the Republican committee staff counsel, who was allowed to ask as many questions as they wanted to in the two depositions released today. And those questions accomplished nothing. They accomplished nothing in their many questions. That is why Republicans did not issue their own set of highlights today from the depositions. No Republican highlights whatsoever. The Democrats released highlights, what they considered the highlights of the depositions. The Democrats issued 9 pages of highlights of the testimony of former ambassador to Ukraine, Marie Yovanovitch, and 5 pages of highlights from the testimony of Ambassador Michael McKinley, a former senior advisor to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Jim Jordan had about a 2-minute interlude with Ambassador McKinley in which Jim Jordan asked absolutely nothing relevant to the investigation, softball stuff that meant nothing. But when Jim Jordan made a reference to Ambassador McKinley's lawyer sitting there with him in the deposition, Ambassador McKinley said, "I had to be talked into approaching a lawyer. I didn't want to deal with legal. My approach to coming to this was I saw the request, I answered it before I even talked to any legal counsel. And my approach was, why should I need legal counsel to come here and talk about this?" But that's not the way Washington works, apparently. That is certainly not the way Washington works for the 4 Trump administration officials who defied impeachment inquiry subpoenas today and refused to show up for their depositions. The most important of those is the man who everyone rushed to complain to after Donald Trump's phone call with the president of Ukraine, John Eisenberg, the lawyer for the National Security Council. John Eisenberg is now hiding behind the Trump administration directive that Ambassador McKinley and Ambassador Yovanovitch ignored, the directive to not testify to the impeachment inquiry. The testimony of the ambassadors proves that there is no legal basis whatsoever for the Trump administration blocking any of this testimony. Mike McKinley testified under oath that he agreed to the committee's request without even checking with a lawyer. Why should I need legal counsel to come here and talk about this? That's what he said. That window on Mike McKinley's integrity and old-fashioned Washington respect for Congress and congressional subpoenas stands as the model by which history will judge how witnesses carried out their duty to the Constitution, to the truth, in the impeachment inquiry of Donald J. Trump. Here's what Chairman Adam Schiff said today about the witnesses who refused to testify today.
This will only further add to the body of evidence on a potential obstruction of Congress charge against the president.
And so the choice for Trump administration witnesses subpoenaed by the impeachment inquiry is to defy the subpoena and add to the evidence of obstruction of Congress, which is an impeachable offense, or testify and add to the evidence, which already has proved that Donald Trump solicited Ukraine's help in his reelection campaign when he asked the president of Ukraine to investigate Joe Biden. There is no third option available to Trump administration witnesses. Theoretically, the third option could be testify to the impeachment inquiry and provide evidence helpful to Donald Trump's defense. But the reality is there is no such evidence to present. That's why they won't testify. And there isn't even a defense theory to present. That's what we discover in the transcripts. The cowardly lions, Jim Jordan and Mark Meadows, prove that in their very weak entries in the deposition transcript released today that there is absolutely no defense of Donald Trump. Ambassador Yovanovitch tells the dramatic story in her testimony about being called in the middle of the night by a State Department official telling her to leave her post in Ukraine and come back to Washington on the next plane. The person calling her had no idea why she had to come back. She said she felt threatened when Donald Trump's phone call with the president of Ukraine became public, and he said in that phone call, quote, "She's going to go through some things." She still feels threatened, she testified. She told the impeachment inquiry that she got Trump management advice from Gordon Sondland, the completely inexperienced ambassador to the European Union, who bought his ambassadorship with $1 million contribution to the Trump inauguration and who knows what else. With members of the Ukrainian government telling her she needed to, quote, watch her back because of what Rudy Giuliani was up to in Ukraine, Gordon Sondland gave her advice about how to handle the president of the United States. Ambassador Yovanovitch testified, quote, he said, you need to go big or go home. You need to, tweet out there that you support the president and that all these are lies and everything else. And, obviously that was advice. It was advice that I did not see how I could implement in my role as an ambassador and as a Foreign Service officer. Some of Donald Trump's ridiculously inept, inexperienced, rich ambassadors who have purchased their ambassadorships have publicly tweeted their devotion to Donald Trump, but not a career Foreign Service officer. How strange would it be for an ambassador to be tweeting public worship of Donald Trump? Ambassador Mike McKinley testified, I have spent 37 years being a diplomat. Being a diplomat for the United States means supporting millions of Americans overseas. It means supporting our companies to create jobs at home. It means resolving conflicts that impact the United States. It means keeping the homeland safe. It means working with our military, the agency, all of our civilian agencies on protecting our interests and influence overseas. It means projecting American values. In this context, frankly, to see the emerging information on the engagement of our missions to procure negative political information for domestic purposes, combined with the failure I saw in the building to provide support for our professional cadre in a particularly trying time, I think the combination was a pretty good reason to decide enough, that I had no longer had a useful role to play. Mike McKinley testified that he spoke to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo 3 times about issuing a public statement of support for Ambassador Yovanovitch. Here's what Mike Pompeo said about that 2 weeks ago.
From the time that Ambassador Yovanovitch departed Ukraine until the time that he came to tell me that he was departing, I never heard him say a single thing about his concerns with respect to the decision.
So you were never asked to put out
not once, George, did Ambassador McKinley say something to me during that entire time period.
No, Mike, not once. 3 times. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.